many people are joining the group. Thank you, Rachel. Some familiar faces and some not so familiar faces, which is really great. So because we've got such a big group, I won't go around doing introductions at this point, because that'll take a lot of time, I think, of the kind of shortest session we've got. But I do want to hear from you all kind of as part of this session, as many as you can as part of the session. So perhaps when you ask questions or give comments in a short while, you could introduce yourselves at that point, if that's okay. So to start things off, I've got some slides to share. Can you see my screen? Rachel, can you put your thumb up or thumb down?
Yeah, we can.
That's fantastic, thank you. So I'm Lee Atkins here, and I'm a CORC Improvement Officer, as many of you will have met me, some of you won't. And I want to talk about being curious, how we use outcomes, measures and feedback tools to explore the world of a young person and be curious about their thoughts and feelings, if you like. So the broad outline for I want to kind of structure this session is like this in 3 parts. So I want to talk about a recent project which Kate mentioned a moment ago, the mental health assessment pilot for looked after children. As I said in the chat, learning from this is all about using measures in a curious manner to be explorative and things like that. It's not about assessments, it's not about looked after children. I deliberately didn't put looked after children in the kind of the headlines for this session, because I didn't want people to put off the fact that, oh, we don't work with looked after children or the like. So the learning is much wider than looked after children, and it's much wider than mental health assessments. So it's not limited to those sorts of things. So more on that in a moment. I do want to obviously hear from you guys about your experiences, about whether it is practical, feasible, realistic to use measures in this kind of way, being curious and being empathetic, things like that. And if so, what are the challenges and what kind of facilitates this kind of work? And are people doing it like this? And for the future is actually, if this is the way we want measures to be used, and evidence suggesting that the young people are suggesting this is what we want, now how do we embed this into future work? How do we make this kind of part of practice? Because we've got, I think, some way to go. So what is this? Right, so the project I want to talk about here was funded by the Department of Education, and this is from the gov.uk page here. So children in care will get better mental health assessments as they enter the new care system. That's also about better assessments for young people entering care or in care. And this is the back of reports suggesting that young people in care don't get a very good assessment of their mental health. They get physical health assessments and a very limited mental health assessments. And all kind of sides, all stakeholders in this kind of report, it's not done very well, and young people don't feel like they're understood or the needs to considered very well at all. Okay, so the outcome of this piece of work was to improve the mental health and emotional well-being assessments that children receive when they enter care. So they are consistent, they are thorough and good quality, they enable accurate identification of need, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, they occur at the right time, and importantly, they are needs focused and person-centered. Okay, this is what we're doing this work for. Okay, so the principles of this pilot assessment that 9 areas in the UK kind of adopted in different ways, different cohorts of young people, if you like, but the principles are exactly the same. It is relational. It is all based on relationships with the young person and the carers and the person around those young people. And this is focusing on the general kind of concepts of well-being, not just diagnosing or kind of putting a tag on a disorder or problem. It's about general well-being, that they kind of strengthen their needs and their difficulties and things. It has to be about building trust with the young person and their carers and the system around that child to make it work. And it has to be about shared decision making with the child and the young person, as I'll see in a moment. That's essential to this way of working. It is important to capture a shared understanding with the system and developing a narrative about the young person that can be shared with other professionals. And this comes out of lots of reports of young people saying, having to tell their story multiple times to multiple professionals. Changeover in social workers is one thing, but actually being passed to a mental health professional and another one and like that, having to repeat your story, it's infuriating and for young people. So how could we overcome that? And also, the whole point of the assessment is how do we understand the type and level of need for that young person? That's what I think is really important. We'll come back to this in a short while. Is actually the assessment process itself can be therapeutic if we're understanding how a child feels about the world and things like that, and they feel understood. Then that's a therapeutic intervention. And the word here is mentalized, if you like. And I'll talk about what mentalized means in a moment, and a Freud term. Let's not get too caught up in that. But that's kind of the point to make. Actually, by doing this, by doing an assessment with a young person, using tools in this way, that in itself is a therapeutic piece of work. So the piece of work started off with training for all staff who would be involved in these mental health assessment pilots. Okay, so a whole mix of LAC staff, social care staff, mental health professionals, and all sorts of associated staff. Some of those staff will have been familiar with using outcome measures, but many of them weren't. Many of the staff here were quite nervous about talking about mental health or talking to young people about mental health, because they kind of previously saw mental health as a specialist role. They referred on to mental health professionals for that kind of work. So we kind of into new territory here. A lot of these staff, for many kind of LAC staff and social care staff, they haven't had a chance to try out outcome measures at all. Albeit, you may know this, but the SDQ is kind of mandated for looked after children. But all the evidence is it kind of is done pretty badly, pretty poorly. It's not done with the young person or carers in mind. Lots of issues around how the kind of the feedback from that is used or not used, things like that. So that's one of the things about assessments not being done very well and how we can improve it. So social care members may be aware of the SDQ but didn't know anything about it or how to interpret it or what it meant and things like that. So never mind using it with in conversation with children, young people, and carers. Okay, so these are some of the slides that I used to train the whole lot of professionals on this pilot here. And as the first thing to see here is I refer to outcome measures as practice tools, or we refer to them as practice tools. So we've got away from the language of outcomes, measurement tools, and that, actually saying these are tools for your practice, tools to help your direct work. Just like a carpenter would go to work with a saw and a chisel, staff doing this will take these practice tools with them. Okay, so that's kind of the language we changed there. And they were used to benefit direct work to get a better understanding of the mental health and wellbeing strengths, difficulties, and needs of young people, and to enable improved support for them. Okay. Obviously, we explained about what they were. I won't go through this. I think you guys know about outcome measures, or if you don't, we've got lots of stuff on our CORC website to explain more about them. So I'll do that now. But I think this slide is really helpful because the way we kind of explain practice tools as being helpful to the practitioner, no matter whether you're a mental health professional or a LAC professional or social carer, is actually what's important is they are able to provide valuable information and insights about the mental health and well-being of young people. And they put young people at the centre of assessments. So there's no mention of kind of evaluation, commissioning or monitoring or things like that, or management information. It's about those things. That was solely kind of our focus on doing this. It's for the young person, for their networks, if you like, and for the system to help be better at helping those young people. I'm just going to move my screen around here. Okay. Oh, okay. So central to this was this idea of having a wellbeing passport for the young person. And the idea being, as I mentioned earlier, young people don't have to repeat their story to multiple professionals. So they can be a central place where their thoughts and feelings, their strengths, difficulties, their needs are kept and the young people are happy with, and that can be shared when they wanted with professionals. Okay. So that wellbeing passport actually could be completed by asking a few people a few questions. Okay. We want it to be holistic and person-centered. So we produced this diagram here. So as you can see at the bottom, we have a non-gender specific young person, look at the child here. And the questions we're trying to answer with wellbeing passport is, are my emotional, mental health strengths, difficulties and needs understood? Do I feel listened to? That's the ultimate question. So before any passport was kind of finalized, the young person themselves had to feel that the answers to those was, yes, I'm being listened to and I'm understood. Okay. To do that, we need lots of information. We need lots of information around a child. So we need information from the social care and LAC service team about their kind of observations and their knowledge of that young child and their placements and things like that. We would have helpful to have information from carers and birth parents about their perspective on the behaviour, the needs of the child. Information from school, what's their relationship with teachers like, with peers like, what's their attendance like, things like that. Yeah, it's insights for education there. Information from health, and importantly, information from the child. So what are they thinking and feeling, what their inputs to it. So by using practice tools effectively with a mentalizing stance, we can collect valuable information and produce passports which are meaningful to the child. So again, that word mentalizing comes up. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But for now, when we use the word mentalizing, just think being curious, being empathetic, being explorative. Okay, that's kind of shorthand for those things, if you like. So it kind of places the need for outcome measures quite firmly, or the benefits of outcome measures quite firmly in kind of putting this passport, because you can imagine without using outcome measures, only part of that passport could be completed. So having some data from schools and some information from the health or from legal services, it wouldn't be a very thorough passport. Outcome measures would really help us fill in those gaps, if you like. So here The young use of practice tools in a mentalizing manner, that word again, means that the voice of young people is central to the assessment, meaning their views and perspectives are at the core of the process. This is the whole point about kind of their voice being central to this. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of background how we kind of placed the practice tools, outcome measures in this piece of work. Because this piece of work was developed for ages 0 to 18, and it's for caregivers, child and professionals to complete measures and put data and onto the wellbeing passport, you can imagine there was a whole range of tools services could use, and this is the kind of matrix of measures that the 9 sites would use. I don't want to go into this in detail now, just say that there's a number there. Okay. So this term mentalizing stance was introduced to all these staff as part of this training, as part of this program. Ultimately, what's it mean? It's about paying attention and being curious about a young person and how they're feeling, what the world is like, and ultimately taking their perspective. Actually, what's it like to sit in their shoes, to see the world from where they are? And that's kind of impossible, really, to feel what a young person feels and sees the world. But do our best to kind of take their perspective, if you like, and provide empathy and validating actually how you feel. Is probably we understand that completely. Absolutely, got these young people obviously have been in the care system. If not all of them have been through an element of trauma, because going into care itself is obviously a traumatic experience actually, and validating things like upset, anger, low mood, things like this, anxiety is actually probably quite normal responses to traumatic experiences, things like that actually. So using outcome measures with these 3 in mind, and we use this term professional APE to kind of help people remember these 3 things here. So A for attention, P for perspective, and E for empathy and validating. So they're the key things, I guess, when we talk about using outcome measures in a mentalizing stance. That's what we mean. So much so, we kind of developed this kind of training package that I'll talk about in a moment. So what does that actually mean? It means obviously building trust, having open, honest conversations with young and the carers, with young people and carers about the tools. It means using the tools in conversation, which is, I want to talk about that in a moment, really, kind of, because that has its implications. And checking out and discussing the learning from the tools, and obviously giving and checking out feedback on the results of the tools. So concentrating on being curious, taking perspective, providing validation for the young person. So it's about judging or challenging. It's about getting the best understanding we can of children and young people's needs and strengths. Okay, so the basis of this training about using practice tools, outcome measures, was the 6 steps here. So the first was about using a suitable tool for the job, and getting away from the idea that there's a best tool. It's a suitable tool for the job, and kind of knowing what the tools are out there and how they work, things like that. But importantly, whatever tool you're using for your work with a young person or the carer, is being familiar with it. So following that kind of first step of downloading it, filling it out as if you were a young person, really kind of checking out what are the kind of challenges around completing the measure, what would need to be explained, how the young person might feel when they fill it in, that sort of things like that. And using that kind of insight into preparing to introduce it. So I think that's really the crucial bit in a lot of this, is how to actually introduce an outcome measure like the STQ or all sorts of other measures in this piece of work here. But it's all about how you introduce it and how you explain it and how you get the kind of buy-in to it, and using the measure, importantly, to explore and to understand. Okay, and that for me is a really important piece of work. That's my experience of using outcome measures, that I've spent an hour discussing just one of the STQ lines with a young person, and it's been really meaningful and really powerful. That hour wasn't wasted. That an hour was a brilliant hour. That's just one thing on STQ, and that's absolutely fine. And it was really meaningful and really helpful. But I think that's something we'll talk about in a moment. But obviously preparing to give feedback and discuss responses. So it's not about you getting information from them, taking it away and filling in your sheets, things like that. Actually saying, well, let's check this out, let's discuss it. Exactly why I spent an hour on the one question with a young person to follow their leads and took me down that route. And importantly, obviously, lastly, planning ahead for all of this, because you can't do any of these without planning ahead. So it's not about turning up for a session with a young person and expecting to be able to use outcome measures in this way without planning ahead. Okay, so those 6 steps have informed the wider CORC training on use of measures, actually. So we don't use the word mentalizing stance, we use terms like curious and empathetic and validating and explorative, things like that. Hopefully many of you will have seen our website. Those that haven't, those that have, just a reminder, there are a number of freely available bite-sized training sessions that you can use and share and talk about, things like that. And the link is at the top of the screen there. We'll get these slides here. and one exactly going through those 6 steps. And it has been made with young people as well. So young people have given their voice to this as well. So it's a really interesting piece of work. It fits in with a whole rack of the training there. So please do go and see that, check out that. But you can see the 6 steps I mentioned there is just our general kind of CORC advice for how we recommend outcome measures are used. Okay, so after all this, what's the important bit then? What did we find? So I was lucky enough to speak to staff at each of the 9 sites doing this pilot on a regular occasion throughout the whole process, if you like. And what one service reported back, and I think kind of talked about all the 9 sites, really said actually their use of SDQ moved from being a really meaningless process to being really meaningful. Okay, so the SDQ initially got a bad rep as being actually, why are we doing it? What's the point? It's just a score we get on a system. We don't like it. That's excellent. It was meaningless. But using it in this kind of curious, explorative, empathetic way moved them from being meaningless to meaningful. And that kind of consensus was that the SDQ actually is meaningful when used in the right way. And that was our kind of feeling, our hypothesis, if you like, when we started the project, actually, that the SDQ is not the wrong tool or bad tool. It's just the way it's being used. Just as I talked about in the training, that if a carpenter wanted to screw in a screw into a wall and use a pair of pliers, that would be really difficult and really hard work. And the temptation might be to say, these pliers are rubbish, or that screw is rubbish. But they aren't. They're actually brilliant tools, just used in a bad way. And I think that's commonly what we get from SDQ. That's not to say it's the perfect tool in every situation, but that's we got there. What came out quite strongly from social workers, lack staff, and mental health professionals is actually by using tools in this way, they learn more about the children and young people they were working with. Some quotes from social workers saying, actually, I've worked with this young person for 2 years. I then used one of the measures in this way, and I learned something about them I never knew anything about them. And new information came up just around this conversation, and that was startling for me and really helpful. If only I'd done this earlier, things like that. So some of the staff saying, actually, it's changed my practice. I'm going to use measures like this way more often, regardless of the pilot. I'm going to kind of commit to doing this. This is really, really helpful. Many staff like the idea of having new measures that they become familiar with and to be used in different contexts, different ways, things like that. However, not everyone said every measure was perfect in every context. So we had young people, staff working with young people, different ages, different contexts, different needs, things like that. Some staff really loved the resilience tools. Other staff loved the SDQ, or carers loved one kind of care questionnaire. It kind of a mix, kind of what professionals liked or found worked different in different settings, different staff members. So that's something else to think about as well. However, there was some feedback from people who were less familiar with measures. Actually, on that matrix that I showed you earlier, there's a lot of tools on there. And actually, to get head around all of these is kind of too much. There's a lot of hard work, and maybe we should have focused on 1 or 2 and done that kind of consistently rather than kind of opening up to a wider choice. But there we go. Yeah, a bit overwhelming for some people. Ultimately, the feedback from children and young people is kind of what I heard from the sites was very positive. Actually, the young people really valued their wellbeing passport and really kind of took ownership of it. But what I haven't said is that wellbeing passport, the whole idea was it was written in their words. So it was said, I feel this, I got this, and things like that. And nothing went out as we shared about the young person saying, yeah. And if there was things on there, actually, maybe a professional reported something or a teacher said something and the young person wasn't sure about, it's about their kind of saying, well, I think this, but my teacher thinks this. So it's about their kind of their deliberation about that, what was being said about them. And that was really important. They owned it. But of course, it's not all happy sailing. Pretty much everyone involved in the pilot reported about their problems or challenges around the time burden from this. You may know that social workers, like a lot of people, are really under the cosh, very limited time, and lack staff going to do home visits, things like that, to really kind of 45-minute, 1-hour sessions with young people. We've got a lot to do. Whereas completing the measures in this way take a lot of time. You know, I mentioned actually spending 1 hour on one question on SDQ, and that was fine. It doesn't mean you'll spend an hour on every question, but actually like 1 hour on one question is an hour. It's time. So having a conversation with a young person around the tools is an extra time. Albeit I would counter that and say actually it is time well spent. It is part and parcel of the therapeutic kind of situation, if you like. So it's not additional time, it's actually really helpful time. But additional to that time burden of actually using the measures, having a conversation around it, then professionals had to go away then and score the measures, put them on a system, write up the findings, interpret the findings, and they didn't have the time for that actually, especially when there was more than one measure they had to use. So there was lots of things around space and time for that. How do we give staff that time? How do we make that system easier for them? the idea of this mentalizing kind of language, mental approach, actually, most people said, actually, that's quite familiar to us. We've done training around being empathetic and being curious. That's what we're about, really. But what they did say is often we don't use those sorts of things, not conflict on those things when we're asking a person's questions or completing outcome measures with them. So by doing this, by thinking of paying attention to the mentalizing principles, remember the professional ape, allowed us to actually really have a better, deeper conversation with a young person, but it requires a lot of effort and a lot of attention. And I've covered mentalizing in a very quick way, and I'll give you a link to a kind of more information about mentalizing, if you like, because it's kind of a very Anna Freud thing. It's embedded in lots of kind of training that Anna Freud provides there, and part of it as well is looking at yourself. Because actually, it's very difficult to pay attention and focus on a young person if you're distracted, if you're stressed, if you're tired, things like that. So actually looking at yourself as well as looking at the young person and saying, actually, how can I kind of mentalize a young person if I'm feeling like this? So it does require a lot of effort and attention to do this. So the burden on staff is there. Okay. As I mentioned, if you want more information about the mentalizing training, the mentalizing approach, there's loads of it on the Anna Freud website. It's an Anna Freud thing, if you like. Some of you may already know about it. It's part of the Ambit training, things like that. Check it out. It's all on there. Yeah, I really like it. I was new to mentalization before this pilot, but say the principles, the ape, and being curious, things like that, we've embedded into kind of our general core training into how to use outcome measures and feedback tools. Okay, well, what I want to do now is pause here now, and I want to ask you guys: is this approach using outcome measures in this kind of mentalizing way? Is it happening? Is it feasible? What are the challenges and what are the things that are enabling to happen? So while you're thinking about that, I thought I'd ask Rachel here, who's our CORC Young Person's Involvement Officer, to kind of help us with the voice of young people, because ideally we have young people here today kind of giving their voice on this and saying actually what they feel about it. Obviously it's a school day, it's able to take young people along, but Rachel has been working with young people in this very area, haven't you, Rachel? What can you say about the young person's voice in this work, do you think?
Yeah, so I think what could be a useful resource for people to have a look at is a video that we made a few months back about young people's engagement in outcome measures, and essentially they were reflecting on what makes it meaningful and sort of purposeful, and essentially looking through their quotes and their ideas. It came down to the purpose of it being explained to them, and kind of why it was happening. They didn't mind that they were contributing to kind of research, for example, if that was explained, and they found it most helpful if if it was explained how it would help them in their care and kind of how that information would be talked about more broadly. I was thinking whilst I was listening to Lee speaking that it can be quite like this is talking about the passports, but it's applicable to kind of any setting in which outcome measures are used. And one thing that some services we've worked with have found helpful is to engage with groups of young people to basically think with them about their experience of the outcome measure. So where it's not possible to change the outcome measures themselves, thinking about how they will kind of from start to finish of an appointment or everything surrounding it, what it is to interact with those outcome measures, and sort of taking them through that journey in a conversation in a sort of consultative space rather than in a session, a therapeutic session itself, can be really helpful. So yeah, just I would recommend kind of advocating for using the patient engagement groups, or if you're in schools, wellbeing champion style groups, or school counsellor, like just any sort of school group that young people might be involved in, that you could take them through these ideas and kind of get a sense of what it's like for them to experience good outcome measurement work or otherwise. So yeah, and I just wanted to make one final point about the time burden as well. I think one of the things that young people said was that it actually meant if they were engaged properly with an outcome measure, they actually might stay with the service. So in that sense, it's actually a time saver, because you're less, I mean, I don't actually have the research for this, but from these experiences that young people have spoken about, you're less likely to have a drop off of young people who feel very bombarded by an outcome measure but don't know why it's there. So actually that explaining and using it in that curious way and creative way can actually be a bit of a time saver in the long run, even if it takes has a bigger time burden at the beginning. So yeah, Lee, am I going to stop recording now so that people can ask questions openly? So I'm just going to stop the recording. Yep.